Hello and welcome to another episode of Jacob's House of Rock. And in today's episode, I'm going to be doing a video response to another YouTuber's content, which is probably the first time I'm doing this. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a video by a YouTuber named Adam Neely. The video is entitled Why Pop Music or Modern, I forgot what it was, just pop music or modern pop music sounds bad, in brackets, to you. This video is, the main premise of this video is basically sort of refuting all the claims that other sort of videos with similar titles make, sort of like saying there are all these actual reasons, saying what's wrong with modern day pop music. But his video is basically trying to point out that it's not actually the music, it's all just you from your sort of experiences and that sort of stuff. But we'll get into it because for the most part I agree with a lot of points he's saying. He illustrates them very well, and a lot of the stuff in this thing is true. It's just his main conclusion of the video that is just wrong, absolutely wrong. And I'm going to get into that in this video. So what we're going to do is I'm going to play you the first couple of minutes of his video, then I'll comment on that, then we'll go through it like that. I'll probably won't play the whole thing because I don't want to be leeching off of Adam's work putting together his video and filling up my runtime with that, because a lot of the stuff I just sort of agree with, so we don't really need to delve deep into it. It's just his main conclusion that we'll get into when we get up to that point in the video. So yeah, I'm gonna cut away now and we'll experience Adam's video.
So you ever notice how music was just better in the past? Culture writers love to remind you of this fact by comparing the modern drivel that is pop music these days to the great songwriters of the past, like, for example, the Beatles. But culture writers have been singing the same song for quite some time now. The Beatles in their day were absolutely panned by the cultural elite. Don Page of the Los Angeles Times called the Beatles playing on the Ed Sullivan Show, quote, an assault on society. The Boston Globe wrote that the Beatles are not merely awful, they are so unbelievably, horribly, so appallingly unmusical, so dogmatically insensitive to the magic of the art that they qualify as crowned heads of anti-music. A generation earlier, jazz music, the music that was popular with the youth of that era, received an even more punishing appraisal. Conductor Frank Damrosch would write, jazz is to real music what the caricature is to portrait. And Ladies' Home Journal would write in 1922, welfare workers tell us that never in the history of our land have there been such immoral conditions among our young people. The blame is laid on jazz music and its evil influence on the young people of today. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who shares these opinions now. We don't typically think of the Beatles and jazz music as having a particularly degenerate effect on today's youth.
You are a degenerate!
Why might that be? Did these forms of music somehow get better over the past century? Or is there something else at play?
Alright, so there we see he opens up his video by bringing up this sort of idea that a lot of people, cultural writers and all that, generally look at modern day pop music and sort of pan it, and have all the sort of attitudes like, oh, back in my day the music was so good and now it's meh. And he brings that up, and that's sort of his leading statement. But then he starts to go into a very valid point, saying jazz music, the Beatles, those sort of types of music, that they were initially also critically panned during the time that they came out, but that nowadays we would look at anyone who critically pans those types of music as kind of silly. It's not even something to think of. And his sort of last statement there was, has the music got better over time, or is there something else at play? And it's an interesting way to start your video. It brings up some valid observations, I would say. He still hasn't gotten to his point. The one which I have an issue with, so far so good. So let's continue watching, shall we?
So, it turns out that your taste in music as an adult is not fully governed by objective qualities in the music itself, rather it's heavily governed by your biographic information. who you are, where you were born, and most interestingly, when in your life you first heard the music that you now like. A 2018 New York Times study of Spotify data reveals that adult musical preferences are most influenced by childhood listening habits around the ages of 13 to 14. There happens to be a strong correlation between popularity of songs in terms of number of Spotify plays, when they were released, and the current age of the listener. That's the Way Love Goes, released in 1994 by Janet Jackson, is popular among 35-year-old women, and Crazy Love, released in 1970 by Van Morrison, is popular among 63-year-old men. Neuroscience has confirmed what data analysis has found. The music that we like in our youth, we like for life. Daniel Levitin, author of This Is Your Brain on Music, writes, 14 is a sort of magic age for the development of musical tastes. Pubertal growth hormones make everything we're experiencing, including music, seem very important. We're just reaching a point in our cognitive development where we're developing our own tastes, and musical tastes become a badge of identity. Now,
so, in this part of the video, he kind of goes into his main sort of point in the video, which is this theory that when we are in our early teens, at about 13 or 14, the music we hear at this time is music that we love for the rest of our lives. And you know what? This is a very valid point. I actually really agree with this. It's definitely a realistic phenomenon, I think. And he goes into it quite a bit. So I didn't put the whole thing in there because this is a point that I agree with. So I just put his little summary of it in there, and he elaborates on it quite a lot more. But it's his next points that kind of gets me a little bit. So he basically attributes this trait of loving the music that you hear in your youth as the reason why people don't like pop music, modern day generic run-of-the-mill garbage pop music that you hear on the radio. And yeah, that's really where his sort of correlation and causation issues come into play, I think, because the funny thing is he actually even acknowledges that liking this music doesn't mean necessarily that you don't like music that you hear in the future.
I mean that our taste in music as adults is completely fixed? Well, not really. I discover new music all the time that I find quite exhilarating. But it is different.
Yet his argument is that all these other theories about what's wrong with pop music, all the other actual reasons that you can objectively look at pop music in the mainstream pop music and say, okay, well, it's degenerated consistently down to this. It uses brainwashing techniques. The people who are writing it don't know a thing or two about actual music. They're not trying to further the art of music. None of that. No, it's just because we like the music that we heard when we're 13 or 14, then this is probably why you hate pop music. And that's pretty much what his video boils down to, unfortunately. And I find that to be just plain wrong. I mean, no idea how his video even got so many likes, to be quite honest. But like I said, his explanation of all of this stuff of the phenomenon is done really well. He put in a lot of research and all that, but the jump to the conclusion that is why people don't like pop music is just absurd to me. And this is what I detailed in my comment. My comment below. So he does quickly acknowledge, like I said, that it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't, like music that you hear in the future, but I think he underestimates that quite a bit because, no, I don't think no matter how old you are, no matter how much you love the music that you love from that age, there's nothing stopping you from liking music in the future if it's good music. So I'll go back to his point about the Beatles and jazz, because we didn't get to elaborate on that at that time. So the thing about music like jazz and the Beatles and all of that stuff is when it was initially critically panned, it wasn't critically panned because those people who were panning it listen to something else when they were 13 or 14. I mean, that's probably part of it. I'm not saying it's not a part of it, but actual main reason, if you look at it, is the people who are panning this type of music, or any type of new music really, were panning it because they had an agenda. The music that they were panning, for example, the jazz and the Beatles, or even something like, for example, Elvis in the early days, or heavy metal, or any other sort of genre that, you know, when it first came out, was considered to be provocative or aggressive, or, you know, caused societal problems. That they didn't have an objective musical reason to hate it. They will claim that they do, a lot of them, because, you know, they probably just didn't like it because, you know, a lot of this music takes some listening to in order to enjoy. It's the type of music you grow into, a lot of this stuff, at least depending on where you're coming from. But realistically, the reason that jazz was panned was because it had a, you know, this idea of like this sort of very this whole culture behind it, where, you know, at least how it was presented, that it had this sort of youth culture of excess and, like, you know, scandal and all of that. That was sort of where a lot of this hatred of jazz in the early days came from. The same could be said about the Beatles. The same could be said about Elvis. Like in particularly the Beatles, you know, there was this whole thing about you know, because they got so big and famous, and the sort of the reaction they got from their female fans and all of that sort of stuff, and, you know, the thing John Lennon said about, you know, they're bigger than Jesus, and it just caused an outrage in the Christian community and all of that stupid stuff. So a lot of like and to be fair, a lot of the early Beatles stuff wasn't musically that wonderful either, but they definitely grew into being a force musically later on, I'd say. But that's just my personal sort of thoughts about the Beatles. But the idea that you that's what you know, stops people is, you know, ridiculous. Because, like, I'm gonna go into some personal experiences of mine now. So before getting into myself, I'm going to talk about my dad. So my dad, he grew up, the music that he loved, that he, you know, listened to when he was 13 and 14, and the music that he, you know, listens to primarily for most of his life is, you know, jazz, classical, and rock. That's like his main sort of area. And, you know, he generally has a wide liking of musics, because you know, if you're into prog, you generally are much more susceptible to liking more complex and different types of music. But the thing about you know, him is that he never really got into heavy metal or any of those other sort of genres, or stuff like rap or anything like that, of course. And when in his 60s, because of my influence, he actually got into quite heavily into heavy metal, and not even just like your run-of-the-mill sort of like stuff like, you know, Black Sabbath and Saxon and Judas Priest, and, you know, he loves those obviously, but you know, he even got into some heavier, like really what's the word, extreme genres of heavy metal. For example, stuff like Psy or Pantera he particularly likes, and, you know, even genres such as like Rage Against the Machine, where stuff, well, like rap is quite prominent in their musical style. So, you know, and, you know, he got into these styles of music in his 60s, and you know, it's, and there's this video here saying that because you like music that you liked when you were 13 or 14, that it stops you from liking future music. Which, yeah. But so my personal experience was, and, you know, I really kind of hate to admit this, but when I was about 13, before that, I didn't really listen to much of anything. You know, when I was very young, I listened to classical music because that's what my dad put on. You know, he had a record player, and we'd listen to, you know, stuff like Gustav Holst, Beethoven, and all, you know, that sort of stuff. But when I was about 13, I discovered, because I had like this fancy little radio that I got for Christmas once, and I discovered, you know, the radio basically, And I really hate to admit this, but I actually started out by listening to the garbage shit that, you hear on pop mainstream radio. And, this was in the 13 to 14 sort of years area. Luckily, however, very soon I also discovered my dad's CDs, and with some influence of some, video games such as Destroy All Humans 2, I discovered sort of 60s psychedelic rock and classic rock and that sort of stuff. And also with the influence of something like Grand Theft Auto's San Andreas and like the radio stations they had on there. So that was sort of where my musical styles sort of developed, particularly like with listening to stuff like Hendrix and stuff like that. So that's what I was listening to between the ages of 13 and 14. And yet, from that time, I'm I'm in my, early mid-20s, and from that time, I have now got lots of different bands, different musical styles. My, musical styles that I love are constantly expanding. And they generally are expanding into genres of music that are more complex, more in the realms of progressive rock, that kind of thing. Um, and I think that's a big part of why people don't like pop music, because if you're expanding yourself musically, you're generally moving away from pop music. Pop music is the lowest common denominator of music. It is the simplest, most catchiest shit put together in order to just be catchy and gain the most amount of just attention from people who generally don't know that much about music, don't really care that much about exploring music. So the reason you have these, elite, these like people, I forgot what he called them, but like the music critics sort of panning it, is because if you're passionate about music, if you listen to a lot of music, if you care about music, if it's something that's important to you, you're going to want to develop your musical taste. It's going to happen naturally. If you listen to a pop song over and over again, if you actually like listen to it attentively, it's going to get boring. Now there is the other phenomenon where you have it playing in the background over and over again, and it kind of there's this brainwashing technique that they use when marketing pop music. They make sure they spend like almost the majority of their money that they put into this music, not into making the actual songs or anything like that. They put it into making sure everyone hears it all the time. It's in shopping centers and on the radio and movies, commercials, anything they can get their hands on. They make sure that music gets, you just hear it everywhere, and that is a brainwashing technique that makes people, the people who don't actively listen to music kind of latch onto it because that's all they hear, and they get this familiarity effect. And it's literally a brainwashing technique, and that's what makes them like it, in a sense. Not to mention making something catchy just automatically makes it get stuck in your head whether you like it or not, which also helps that. But if you're somebody who really loves music, you get tired of stuff that lacks complexity quite quickly. Like even stuff that's very simple music that I still love, I can't listen to it for a very long time, a lot of this stuff. That's why I'm not too big on stuff like punk, for example. Like I can put on a good punk song and be like, yeah, this is pretty awesome, but if I have it on like a playlist or something, I don't go back to it very frequently because it's like, well, once you've heard it, you've sort of heard it, basically. But generally, that's why over time I gravitate more towards more complex music, and I believe this is a phenomenon that happens for a lot of people that like that are very into music. And there's a whole lot that actually goes into why people don't like pop music that's far more complex, far more interesting, and far more sinister than just this fallacy that this guy is putting up here. So there's actually a really good video by a YouTuber called 42, I believe. It's a weird spelling. I forget how it's spelled. It's either the word 40 and the number 2, or the number 40 and then the word 2 written out, something like that. And he's this British guy who has this really good video about like why pop music is getting worse and degenerating and all of this stuff. He really articulates this stuff really well, explains it very well. I'll also have a link to that in the description. And the funny thing is Adam actually has a couple of clips of this video in this video. He even has this horrible moment where he just sits scoffing at the beginning of this guy's video.
Music as an art form is dying.
As if his claim is any better. Jesus. So sorry I'm getting a little heated up about this. It's just, this video has a lot of likes. It has, I don't understand, because going through the comments of this, a lot of people do bring up the same stuff that I'm saying, and yet the likes to dislikes ratio on this video is kind of odd to me. So I don't know, because this seems very obvious, the stuff that I brought up in this video, and I don't know. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble now, but I hope you kind of get the idea of what I was saying in this video. I'm gonna, copy and paste my big comment that I had on that video into the description, because I feel like I sum up my points pretty well in that comment, and hopefully I've summed them up somewhat well in this video. And I hope you guys like this type of video and replies to sort of other stuff. I might do more of these in the future. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about this, because this, as somebody who genuinely loves music and is a big part of their lives, the stuff that's going on with like 90% of the music that we hear in our media, the music of our time, I feel really sad that that it's in the state that it's in. And you can just say, well, don't listen to it, listen to what you want to listen to, it doesn't really matter. And I agree to that to an extent, but I feel sad that in 20-30 years people are going to be nostalgic about the music that's being played now, and we'll go back and we'll look at the music of our decades and to be nostalgic about it. And it's like, you can look back at the 60s and be nostalgic about stuff like Hendrix or the Beatles and Jefferson Airplane, Santana, all these wonderful bands. You can go to the 70s, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, even disco, for how watered down and crappy a lot of it is. You have some really good stuff like the Bee Gees. You have stuff like the Jackson 5, Michael Jackson, that sort of stuff. You go to the 80s, a lot of the stuff was pretty watered down in that, but David Bowie and Queen were doing wonderful things in the 80s. Even I love 90s music. Actually, you got stuff like Faith No More, even stuff like Nirvana and Pearl Jam can be pretty enjoyable, even though I don't listen to much of it. Like Faith No More, Primus, Living Colour, these very classic 90s sounding things. And then you start to get into the 2000s and the 2010s, and what? You got Lady Gaga, you got Taylor Swift, who I hate with a passion. You have bloody Kanye, Idiot West. You got all these, I don't know. I feel sad for people, for people who don't go out and actually, explore music to its full potential. But that's just me. Maybe I'm just old. I don't know. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, guys. I know I went onto a bit of a rant here, but it's an important topic, I feel, for us music lovers. Anyway, without further ado, over and out. Keep on rocking. See ya.